say where you're going to be in 5 years. You can't say exactly what it's going to look like. It's going to be quite the challenge to define exactly where you're going to be. And so that means you have to evolve. It's a journey. You're going to pivot. You're going to adjust. And what's important is that you really understand that people trust that you're on that journey. They don't know exactly what good looks like. You know, if you talk about implementing an SAP implementation, you can probably define what the destination looks like. And so that clarity of a destination reduces the need for trust. A lack of a clear destination increases the need for trust. The next is cross-functional dependence. One thing that is really clear with Lean is you have people working across boundaries. You can't connect a value stream end to end and align your functions without people collaborating across functions. And the more cross-functional dependency you have, the more you depend on trust. And so that's a key characteristic of Lean and of some other transformations. That would be one, for example, where an SAP implementation, this would be a very high variable. The third is behavior-centric. For anybody that's read me, followed me, been taught by me, you know that I have taught for almost 30 years that Lean is about behaviors, say probably 25 years for that point. But this has been essential, is that tools and systems are not enough. You have to get the behaviors right. And in that definition of Lean, that means that I can't just train people. I can't just do a bunch of tools and techniques. I've got to get the behaviors right. And so that means you are depending on human beings all around the organization. And that means there's a much higher need for trust. And then the fourth is that Lean brings with it a very high degree of transparency. Problems are more visible, metrics are visible, discussions, half problems that are solved. There's a lot of transparency in a Lean system. And so with that, transparency requires trust, right? If you're going to expose the world, or at least your organization, to the problems in your team, and trust that they don't come back to bite you, that instead you're actually going to get help in solving them, well, without trust, you're not going to you're going to only want to show the rest of the organization what you want them to see. And so that becomes pretty important as well. So the point is that these characteristics, I believe, are the reasons that trust is essential for Lean. And if you find those characteristics in other types of transformations, I'm willing to bet that trust will be pretty important in that condition as well. Now, the next thing to ask is sort of, is trust its own end, right? Is it trust to enable Lean, or is it trust just because we want trust? Now, I'm going to say first, I believe it's more trust for a purpose. Sure, trust is good, but to bother investing your energy into building trust, what are you doing with it? What's its purpose? What are you trying to build? And so to me, this goes back to, well, if Lean is about, Lean requires trust, then that becomes a good reason to invest in building trust in your organization. Now, to contradict myself, I'll share some data in my research that is presented elsewhere. Harvard Business Review, as you can see, this is kind of what happens in high trust versus low trust companies. So they simply scored a company based on trust, based on the respondents. Again, surveys are not perfect methodologies for science, but then looked at these other factors and looked for correlation. Now, what's important is, so if you take a first look at this, you would say, well, geez, trust is great. Look at, I'm going to have more energy, less stress, higher productivity. I mean, that alone, 50% higher productivity says, yeah, let me go invest in trust. That's a pretty good reason. And I think there is some very interesting things here that would suggest that building trust in your organization is good. But I would only say that, you know, correlation is not causation. And so we do have to be careful. it could be that the factors that created these high trust scores are also the same factors that created higher productivity and fewer sick days and less trust or less stress, not that the trust is what created these things. So we do have to be careful to overread into some of this research around trust. But I go back to the point that I do think fundamentally, the relationship between trust and lean is essential, which is why we're here. Now, I'm going to share some other data from the research while I just talk a little bit about how I came up with these 4 C's. So I started with really kind of breaking down my history and working with companies. I've worked with over 300 companies on their lean journey, some just a little bit, some I was heavily invested in their lean journey. And I really looked at what was common around the relationship between trust from a structural, functional standpoint. So really go through my own sort of mental experience base to start to build out a construct. And then through the survey research, we kind of asked people to validate how much these things matter. That's where the same trust is essential came from. So what I would say, this is how many people voted demonstration of care, number 1. Right? So that got the most number 1 votes. This got the most number 2 votes. So everybody was asked to rank these 4 criteria. But what's, other than some clear distinctions here, we see some commonality here where there's no one ingredient that is clearly falls off the list. And so I believe this validates to some degree that these 4 C's that I'm going to go through are all important as far as elements that help build trust. So there's lots of models around trust. Some of them are societal models. Some of them are individual leader models. This is really more of an organizational model. And again, I believe all models are wrong and some are useful. So I'm not going to suggest that my model's better than other models, but I do believe, and again, validated over the past couple months with some coaching, it has been pretty helpful. So let's go into the 4 C's themselves and talk about each one of these in turn. So I'm going to start with the one that got the most votes, and that is the demonstration of care. Now first I want to emphasize that the words here. So this is demonstration, demonstration of care. So the key point here is good intentions are not enough. Right? You might care, but if people don't see evidence of that, you have not demonstrated care, and therefore you've contributed nothing to trust. And so this becomes pretty important from that standpoint. It's what you do that matters, what people see. Now, as I frame this, I do want to make a distinction between what I really call sort of an ethical view of this. And this goes back to the lean principle of respect for people. So this, for me, is by far the best way to approach it, that you believe in respect for people, that you want to emulate and demonstrate respect for people, and that part of your ethic is that you respect people. So I think that, as a leader, as an individual, wherever that comes from, when you can practice the demonstration of care from that basis, it's going to be easier, it's going to be more natural, you're going to live it in a much more fluid way. But I do believe, my own evidence has suggested that there is an alternative viewpoint, and that is more of a functional view. So I do not believe that I'm going to get every leader to internalize as a core high-level principle respect for people and the demonstration of care. I'd like to. I don't think that's even worth my energy to try to make that happen. But there's many leaders, many executives, many site leaders, et cetera, that I know that have what I call a functional view of care. And what that means is that, they don't care what you did on the weekend. They didn't care that you're happy in your work, except where that happiness reflects in your performance. And so this is basically saying, um, why do I care? Well, I care about your performance as an individual, as a team, whatever that might be. And in that performance, what are the ingredients that help make that happen? Well, I care that you are happy. I care that you're engaged. I care that you're stressed or focused. I care that you have what you need to do your job well. So in many ways, the things that you would demonstrate care through are the same whether you have a functional or an ethical view. And so while you have to perhaps be more deliberate with a functional view of care, I believe in the end it can be almost, if not just, as effective. And so I think we have to allow for that possibility for those that either can't or just won't adopt the ethical view of care. Now, other ways that you can demonstrate this. This is not about being nice, right? So this happened a lot with the phrase "respect for people." Is people thought respect for people meant being nice. That's not what it means. It means that you care about that person and what supports them, right? So this means that, as an example, sort of what is often not deemed as nice is that you're very willing to give feedback. When someone isn't performing well, someone isn't effective, someone's behaviors are hurting them, that you're able to give feedback, that you look for the opportunity to give feedback because that shows respect for that person. Now, there's an effective way to give feedback and an ineffective way to give feedback, but again, it's not about being nice. It's about what that person needs. That's what the demonstration of care is, and feedback is one way to demonstrate that. I think another, and we can talk about this in a lot of ways with waste and things like that, but fundamentally, when you find a way to reduce burden for someone, in whatever form that it comes, you have demonstrated care. Because when you use a term like burden, when you find out what's burdening an employee and help to remove that burden, you probably don't have an ROI on that. You probably haven't calculated how many hours you've saved or how many jobs you're going to cut. You've basically just removed burden from that person's work. Now, maybe that'll have a real material payoff and maybe it won't, but that's not, because you started with burden, that's not why you did it. And so that's a way to truly demonstrate care in a lot of ways. So, so the demonstration of care becomes pretty fundamental. We have to get that right. This received the most #1 votes. The way I've personally done this lately, and it might sound like a synonym, is really just demonstration of empathy, which is perhaps more overt, right? Care is intentions. Empathy is more overt. A lot of my coaching calls, knowing what people are going through, I've been starting with 10-minute mental health check-ins. I did a webinar recently for about 400 business owners and actually asked the question as a survey before we started around their mental health. And an awful lot said they were hanging in there, but 3%, which was probably a vastly underreported number, said they were depressed. Well, that's deeply concerning, right? And so, we have sort of 3 waves of pandemic. We have the virus itself. We have the economic fallout. The mental health fallout will be the 3rd wave. And so, this is why right now is an opportunity to demonstrate care. And so whether you're an individual or a company, I think investing some things around mental health for your employee base is fundamental. So before I move on to the next C, just remind you, as you have questions, you don't have to wait till the end. You can start popping them into the chat, and then we'll get to them later. But feel free to ask them as we go. So I'm going to slide up here to the next C, and that's communication. Now, communication, broadly speaking, ends up on most people's leadership lists. But what we're talking about here is really a specific aspect of communication that is important, and that's the communication of context. Now, Now, what do I mean by context? Well, fundamentally, it's the why, right? Whatever that why is, it's helping people understand the context behind decisions and actions. And this builds trust because people see behind the two-way mirror. So again, right now, this is an opportunity where trust is being tested in organizations. I heard in one organization, employees were asking, if someone was infected at my factory, so they would tell us, right? They were basically asking, hey, should we trust our organization or not? Well, that transparency of through communication is fundamental. And again, not focusing too much on current conditions, but most of the CEOs I'm coaching, we've been focusing a lot on demonstration of care through frequent communications, making it more personal, sharing what's going on, whether it's applying for PPP or what we're doing for customers or what we're doing for healthcare workers, whatever that is, but demonstrating more through that communication. So, when it comes to lean, it's really about the why of lean, right? Why are we doing this? What do I hope that brings us? And this is where, historically, if you start to ask people why they're doing lean, they might know what they're getting out of it, but why they started might not have been a very visionary activity. It might have been, my experience, most common reason people do lean is because everybody else is doing lean. And that's fine to start, but you got to have some purpose. You got to know why this is important to you. I believe we're going to see right now the same thing that we saw in 2009, and that is companies that had a clear why in their lean journey will double down. They will make an extra commitment because their purpose and their vision is still true. Those that didn't have a clear why, lean is going to, I don't want to say go by the wayside, but it's going to diminish. It's going to be underinvested. It's going to wane. And I think that's fine. Then you have a new opportunity to refresh it with purpose. But I believe we're going to see quite a bit of that kind of fallout with lean journeys for those that weren't purposeful in their journey. Now, as part of this, we also have to focus on the frequency of our communication. So many lean journeys start with a one shot. Right? They just one shot. We roll out a launch and tell everybody what we're doing. But boy, that's just never enough. Right? So I would prefer you weave in frequent communications to reinforce and then evolve your message. I worked with one CEO as a quarterly forum, and we focused on the why for about 2 years in his quarterly forum. And then after the organization truly got the message, then we focused on what good looks like and the quality of the lean journey and adjusted that message. But there was a cadence to it. It was a frequent part of the conversation. So, it's much more impactful to build it into your one-on-ones, build it into your daily huddles and other cadence-based communications or mechanisms rather than simply roll out a communication plan. Well, I'll make this point next because this is I think the essential point when we think about the effectiveness of our communications. Informal communications is far greater than formal. Yeah, when we think about our planning time, we put 99% of our time planning, drafting, editing, packaging our formal communications, and very little time planning, thinking about, strategizing our informal communications. So what I mean by that is think about what the key questions, what your key message is, what your audience is going to need, and be prepared for those 90-second hallway conversations. What is your message? If you don't know what the answer is to why lean, why are we doing this, what are we doing here, if you don't know the answers to those, you're not likely to use those as effective opportunities. But that informal communication is far more effective than the formal. What this, as an example, I was working with one executive team. We built a model of what lean behaviors meant for the organization. And very proud of ourselves, long sessions, lots of input. At the end, the executive team agreed, this is our list. And then the question came up and they said, okay, how are we going to roll this out? And we're kind of looking at the communications person going, hey, package this up and email it out to everybody. I said, no, that's not what we're going to do. You're going to take this list and you're going to bring it to your staffs and you're going to have a discussion about it. Right? Far more effective than anything we could have packaged. We eventually did do the packaging, but we had to lead with discussion, lead with personal ownership, because that's where people see the transparency, right? Because the informal is trusted far more than the formal. So communication in the survey, interestingly, it wasn't number 2 in terms of how many first place votes it got, but it did have the most number 2 votes. So again, people might not have said it was the most important, absolutely said it was important. So I move over here to competence, talk about competence a bit, and what that means. So competence, and this is really, when I say this, it's the competence to deliver. Right, so there's a couple different levels of this. It's the, I think it starts with, lost my pen here. Well, I'm gonna figure out what happened. Can somebody respond and let me know if we're frozen?
We are frozen.
Okay. My call's still active, so you can still hear me.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, I'm going to give this a minute. I have no idea what locked me up here. This is a new failure mode, but tell you what, are you able, just we'll detour here a second. Are you able to unshare or turn off my sharing and see if that resets it? It won't do me any good to share if I can't draw anyway. So while you're figuring that, I'm going to keep going through the content just so we don't lose any time here, and then we'll see if we can work this in parallel. So in terms of
we're ready to view your screen again if you want to try it.
Okay. Yeah, I do not seem to have control back, but I'm just going to.
I will make you the host.
Yeah, it's something on my end that's a brand new failure mode. So, see what I'm going to do. Again, I don't want to let people sit here watching me fiddle. So I'm going to keep talking while I try to parallel process here. First is the leaders. The leaders trust in the competence of their employees. Why does this matter? Well, fundamentally the employees are, with Lean, you are turning over ownership of improvements, of design, of owning processes, of owning metrics. You are empowering your organization to a great degree, and with that requires trust. Right? How am I, if I'm going to turn over some ownership of a process to a team? Well, then I have to trust that team and I have to trust that process. I can't effectively empower that team by turning stuff over to them and then second guess them halfway through it. So that becomes truly fundamental from that standpoint. The next is the other way around. It's the employees' confidence in the competence of the leaders. Leaders are saying, we're going to go on this journey. We're going to go on this journey, and through that, you have to trust me that I can get you there. If you can't trust me that I can get you there, then how am I going to invest my energy in that journey? So this becomes key as well. So this goes both ways from that standpoint. The next aspect around competence is really building the visibility of building competence in your organization. So nobody's expecting every leader, every employee to have competence for this journey. So the idea is you're not going to have all the competence up front. You have to build that. And through that process, in that you have to demonstrate that you're willing to learn as you go along. So let me pause here a second. Can you still hear me? Because my entire screen is now blank. Back in where I was already talking about how leaders have to trust their employees, and vice versa. I was talking about transparency of competencies, making sure that we show our gaps. And the final point I want to make there is the importance of coaching. Coaching is to me, people, as soon as they hear competence, they hear training. And to me, it really should be about learning, and coaching, especially around building competence, is a much more visible investment in competence than training is. Training is relatively easy. It involves a lot of delegation, and I'm not against training. I used to make a living doing training, but coaching to me, application-based at the point of activity, is far more effective, especially as it relates to competence and trust. And then the last is the consistency. And so the point is, this was interesting. It got the second most number of number one votes. So people, the common comment was essentially, if it doesn't matter how well you do the first three, if you only do them once in a while, it just doesn't matter. And so doing all of these consistency becomes really important. So again, what happens with consistency is often good intentions or good results. Well, we want good results and outcomes. So as an example, actually, when I put this research together, I had one person talk to me and they said, I belong to this organization. I say yes to everything. I try to help where I can be helpful, but I overcommit. And what that means is I underdeliver to my commitments, because I say, yes, I'll help, but I can't help on everything. And so I kind of realized this is probably hurting the trust between myself and the organization, because my consistency isn't there. I'll say yes to 10 things, but only deliver on 7. And so it doesn't matter why somebody couldn't deliver. Fundamentally, if somebody doesn't deliver enough times, you will lose trust. You will abandon your trust that the person will deliver the next time for you. So that becomes fundamental. Now, the two best mechanisms to invest in, one, right up Lean's alley, standardization, right? In all its forms, right? Standard work for employees means that we have consistency in how that work is done. I have a CEO who's currently onboarding somebody. They onboarded the last 3 people with a 90-day standard work format. So how they onboard new executives, and they're working their way through that standard, and that's provided consistency as they're now onboarding their 3rd new executive with a standard. So at any level of the organization, standardization is a mechanism that provides consistency. The other is really is feedback, and this is both having mechanisms to do so, right? What's the mechanism to get the feedback? You don't want people to have to break through and do unusual things to provide that feedback, but also a culture of feedback, right? Meaning that it's welcome when it's received. So provide that when you're off standard, when you're off message. I actually had, was part of a conversation recently where a member of the organization was asking the CEO, why aren't you working from home when everybody else is working from home? So it was a welcomed question because it was, it was presented as a challenge. It would kind of say, it doesn't seem like you're doing the right thing. But it provided, just to connect the CEO, the opportunity to provide some context around why they made that decision. Whether it's the right or wrong decision doesn't matter. It was the culture to provide feedback around what seemed like an inconsistent action, that then the communication was able to fill that gap. So fundamentally, having the opportunity, it's not about avoiding failure. It's about quick correction. Right? I don't believe, and you've seen this with brands, right? Your trust in a brand isn't whether or not they never violate their brand promise. It's that when they do they correct it? Do they rectify it? That's how they maintain their brand promise or destroy it. So it's not about avoiding failures altogether, although certainly that's great. Fundamentally, it is about correcting that to demonstrate that you essentially care about your brand promise or whatever it is you're supporting. Now bringing this back to lean, we have these four C's, and just really kind of frame the question around, which comes first, trust or lean, right? So they build on each other, but what should we do first? Build trust and then go do lean, or start lean and build trust along the way? Well, I believe certainly if you have trust first, that's great. If you've already built it, if you have trust in your organization, that's a great foundation on which to build and launch and strengthen your lean journey. So that's great. But to build trust, as I've talked about, it requires you investing and essentially building these four C's. That requires some platform on which to act differently, right? You don't just walk in on Monday and you didn't screw up, and on Tuesday trust is built. You actually have to go do things to demonstrate care, to communicate context, to be consistent. You need some platform. As I said earlier, what companies are going through in transitions during the pandemic is one of those platforms that's either breaking or building trust. But lean can be that platform as well. And so, if you don't already have a strong culture of trust, I don't think that's a problem. It might mean you'll go slower. It might mean that instead of 3 steps forward and 1 step back, you'll take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But those steps forward are opportunities to build your trust, which will then reinforce lean. And so I think that's important, is don't let trust issues in your organization hinder or stall your lean journey. Simply integrate it and start to make them one and the same. And then it really gives you the opportunity to work on both in the same platform. So I've talked for a while, minus my technology glitches. Love to hear questions, and I think you're gonna. I'm not sure what I missed while I was out, but you'll provide that.
Jamie, I'm just waiting for some questions to come in. It's a pretty quiet group today. You might have to help solicit some ideas from them.
It is quiet. I'll ask a question back. You guys can always share in the chat, and we can react to it, or you can ask a question again. When you think about trust in your organization, are you more concerned about your immediate relationships, or are you more concerned about the organization as a whole? So you can certainly fill in some answers as you feel free to share in the chat as you go. But I do think there's the same thing is true, and I do now have the chat open, but I'll let you still ask the questions, lead them. But as you think about it, I always believe lean is a one heart, one mind at a time journey, and there's no such thing as organizational change. There's lots of people in an organization have changed, and that creates organizational change. And so I believe you should think about trust in an organizational level, but start with your circle of influence and do what you can do there. So I think we have some questions now if you want to fire away.
Sure. Our first question is, what are some ways that you can build visibility of competence within your organization?
So I think there's two, that's a really good question. I think there's two branches of that question. One is a more tactical transparency of competence based on actually showing what they are, right? And so this could be within a team, a skills chart. This could be overall ratings of how people have been rated on overall competencies for the organization. This could be sharing within a team, everybody's personal development plans at some level. So I believe that's a sort of tactical, transactional almost competency transparency. The other is more symbolic. That's the other branch, is symbolic branches. So I'll give an example. I spent a large part of my time in the last 3 years at a company called Qorvo Semiconductor, $3 billion plus company, and I was part-time, but I was on the CEO's staff as an executive. But fundamentally, the CEO, Bob Bruggerworth, brought me on as a coach. He was vocal about that. He was visible about that, and he was also clear that my primary customer in terms of coaching was him, not everybody else but him. I was there first and foremost to coach him to help lead the lean journey. And this made it transparent to the board of directors, to the executive team, and to the company as a whole. And so while we weren't transparent about all the little conversations that he and I had, he was very transparent about the fact that he has a coach to help him be a better leader of lean. And I thought that was, it was very effective, and just the fact that it happened was an impact to the journey itself.
Great. Your next question is, which C do you see companies struggling to get right the most often?
It's a really good question. I probably should have added it to my own survey when I did it. I would prefer to ask the question in a different way, and partly because I'm not sure I have an answer for that. And what I mean by that is, I think it's which C do individuals struggle with the most. So, everybody talks about leadership teams, but an executive team that's made up of 8 to 15 people is 8 to 15 different individuals, many of which probably didn't grow up in that organization, all have different strengths and weaknesses. And so I've worked with teams where, one's really good at care, one's really bad at care, but vice versa on competence. And so I think it's more about individuals from that standpoint. I do think that mostly because we've built in communication through communication groups inside companies and professionals that do that. And again, like I said earlier, it's in every leadership model. We've built in, let me just zoom in here. So this is built into most organizations one way or the other. Competence is built in through HR, competency models, development plans, et cetera, to some degree. And so I think these two are the ones that people struggle with the most. And again, I don't know if it's split 50-50. I've never built a model around that, but I believe some leaders are just, they're very transactional and they have a really hard time demonstrating care. And others just are inconsistent. They know what they want to do, but they are their best version of themselves one day a week. And so the inconsistency is what's hurting them the most. So I believe these two are the answer organizationally, but I prefer to look at it individually because I think ultimately that's how we live it.
Our last question on the chat is, are there specific behavioral indicators that point to a demonstration of real trust, aside from verbal confirmation?
And that's a good question, right? So in some ways, it's how do you measure it, right? How do you measure How do you measure trust? I think there's a lot of corollary measurements. Turnover in an organization going up or down is an indicator of trust. I think there are others around, even sick days, where you certainly see, other than seasonality, you see when people are more frustrated and less trusting of the organization, that they're just more likely to call in sick. Of course, now they should be, but one way or the other. But if I were to have a more pointed measure, it would really be about the speed of adoption. And that is when we roll out anything, right? Whether it's a change to IT security, or hiring practices, or budget rollbacks, or a strategy shift, how fast do we all adopt to that new change? Because I believe trust is the friction that prevents the adoption, right? We're second guessing it. We don't know if it's going to last. We don't know if we should invest our time in it. And so the more trust there is, the less friction, and the faster the adoption speed is. So not just about lean. Lean's too broad to say speed of adoption, but any changes. If there's trust in an organization or a team, I believe the speed of adoption is much higher.
Great. We did have one more come in. We have plenty of time.
All right.
So please bring your questions if anybody else has last minute ones. Our next question is a multi-part question. Are the 4 C's linear or sequential in any way? For instance, if a team member or employee feels their manager doesn't demonstrate care, even if their manager is competent, can communicate well, and is consistent, there might be a trust issue. So what would be a best practice or starting point based on your research?
That's a really good question. And I have to say, empirically, I've never tested them sequentially in any manner. And I think perhaps why it's never even occurred to me to do that is I do think they're all reinforcing. I could probably argue that we should work on consistency first. Work on consistency so you have a baseline of how you operate, and then you can improve what that standard is. So I could make that argument. But at the same time, I would suggest that any investment in any one of these 4 C's is an opportunity to improve trust. For example, if I as a leader don't care about you, and I made a decision and I explain why, and even if part of that explanation is I don't really care if this affects you, well, I actually will trust that leader more. Will I trust them with my career, with my livelihood, things like that? Probably not. But will I trust their actions and their intentions? Yeah, because I understand them. And so even in the absolute absence, of one of the other C's, which is never quite all the way to zero, well, maybe it is, but rarely all the way down to zero, I believe any investments can help move the needle. I think, but if I had to do it sequentially, I think I'd absolutely invest in being consistent, and then I improve what I'm consistent of.
All right, we have one more question. Jamie, what would your definition of training versus definition of coaching be? So
to me, it's best when it's training plus coaching, right? When you can put them together into one aspect. But fundamentally, training in whatever tools and techniques you use, fundamentally it's about efficiency, and it's about consistency, right? However, even if I put coaching into the class or the workshop or whatever that might be, I put 30 people into a program, and I'm gonna deliver content to 30 people, and it's all gonna be consistent. But coaching is usually much more personal and much more timely, in the sense that I coach 3 different people, the topics are going to be all over the map, but I'm going to give this person what they need when they need it, that person what they need when they need it, and that person what they need when they need it. And so to me, these are the differences between the two. But when you can put them together, I think it's absolutely most effective.
Well, we're down to the last minute, Jamie. Do you have anything or a quick synopsis you want to talk about for next year's symposium?
Sure. So while we have plenty of time to plan, we are going to talk, the current plan is to talk about culture and building culture. A broader topic, trust could be part of your culture, but defining your culture, how to build it as a leader at any level in the organization, along with why it matters. So we're going to go a little deeper, we'll have more time. We'll make it like a workshop where we get to actually walk out, ideally with a plan, something you can actually go do. So that's what we hope to accomplish a year from now.
And that will be a fantastic morning session, and we'll have a few breakout sessions looking at some of those pitfalls of lean. If you haven't looked at Jamie's book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to Lean, it's a great read, and we'll address some of those in the afternoon next year. So Jamie, on behalf of everyone that joined today, I just want to thank you very much. Excellent content, extremely applicable, and awesome way to present it. It was engaging, and I thank you very much for taking time out of your day to meet with us virtually and share some of your knowledge.
Glad to do it. Thank you. And I hope everyone's healthy and safe.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone else. Thanks for joining us today, and hopefully we see you next month.